Hey guys, tonight we begin with one apple that has gone soft in the dark. A lantern tilts as someone lowers it down a narrow set of steps. The light moves across a rough wall, a barrel, the edge of a wooden bin, and a row of roots lying under a thin cover of dust. The air changes before the floor is reached. It becomes cooler, heavier, touched by damp earth and the faint sweetness of stored fruit. The apple looks harmless until a hand presses it. Most of the fruit in the bin feels firm. One does not. That is the first lesson of the root cellar. The building does not save the food by itself. It only creates better odds. Someone still has to open the stubborn door, balance a basket against one knee, carry in the lantern, notice the smell, press the fruit, move the damaged piece, and decide whether the rest of the bin remains sound. The modern version of this story is usually cleaner. A family harvests its crops, places them underground, hangs meat in a smokehouse, and then spends winter eating with the confidence of people who have apparently defeated decay using dirt and a small wooden building. History was less cooperative. A root cellar could become too warm, too cold, too wet, too dry, or simply too attractive to mice. A smokehouse could fill with the wrong heat, poor airflow, insects, soot, or a level of optimism that the meat did not share. These were not primitive refrigerators. They were rooms that demanded judgment. And that judgment mattered, because winter did not begin with snow. It began earlier, in the rush before the hard freeze, when food had to be lifted, sorted, carried, cleaned, packed, salted, hung, and protected before weather hardened the soil or damaged what remained in the field. If quiet history built from cold rooms, smoky beams, and one suspiciously soft apple makes good company tonight, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with the one food you would try hardest to protect if winter had already closed the road. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The lantern is still in the cellar. For most of this journey, we will remain in 19th century rural America. Though no single farm can stand for the whole country, a hillside room in Maryland, a stone-lined cellar in the West, a cramped basement corner in New England, and a rough storage pit on a newly settled farm did not face the same ground, weather, crops, labour, or wealth. The title gives us settlers. The room itself gives us particular households. Its light catches the rim of a barrel, the pale surface of a turnip, and a patch of wall where moisture has darkened the stone or timber. Nothing here looks dramatic. That is part of what made the work demanding. Failure often began quietly. A bruised apple did not announce itself. A potato beginning to soften did not ring a bell. A mouse did not submit a request before entering the premises. The household had to notice small changes while they were still small. For many rural families, the cellar was one part of a larger seasonal system. Its exact form varied. Some were dug into a slope. Some sat beneath kitchens, houses, barns, or detached outbuildings. Some were cramped and temporary. Others were substantial rooms built with stone, brick, heavy timbers, shelves, bins, and doors meant to resist weather. Those differences mattered. A household needed enough food to store. It needed containers, tools, time, and people able to carry heavy loads. It needed someone who knew which crops could wait and which should be eaten sooner. It needed space to separate foods that behave differently. And it needed the freedom to spend days preparing for winter instead of using every hour for another urgent task. The word stored hides all of that. It hides the basket biting into a cold hand. It hides the child or worker making another trip down the steps. It hides the person wiping dirt from a shelf, checking a cracked board, lifting a lid, or turning over an apple to inspect a dark mark near the stem. It hides the decision over whether a damaged root should be eaten immediately, fed to an animal, discarded, or risked among the others. The cellar also held food that was not truly still. A harvested root had left the soil, but it had not become a stone. Apples continued to change. Potatoes could sprout. Vegetables could lose moisture. bruised tissue could break down faster than sound tissue. The family was slowing living material that continued to age in the dark. That is why the room needed balance. Cold helped, but freezing could damage food. Moisture helped some crops avoid shriveling, but too much encouraged other problems. Air had to move, but opening the door at the wrong moment disturbed the little climate inside. There was no dial, warning light, or polite machine voice announcing that conditions had changed. There was only the room, the weather, the stored food, and the person paying attention. Outside, the farm was moving toward another deadline. Livestock that would supply winter meat could not simply be led into the smokehouse and asked to become bacon through atmosphere. Butchering, salting, curing, drying and smoking belonged to a chain of labour, and colder weather often shaped when that chain began. Smoke mattered, but it was not magic. The building became useful only after difficult work had happened elsewhere. This is where the two structures reveal their opposite purposes. The cellar protected foods that still held moisture and remained biologically active. It borrowed steadiness from the earth and used darkness, enclosure, and careful storage to slow change. The smokehouse followed another logic. Meat required a different struggle against time, using salt, drying, smoke, controlled exposure, and repeated attention. One building tried to prevent selected crops from drying or freezing too quickly. The other tried to remove moisture and alter fresh meat so it could last longer. A family might therefore spend autumn managing two climates that wanted almost opposite things. No thermostat, no electric fan, no sealed plastic container, just walls, soil, wood, smoke, salt, weather, memory, and the consequences of getting something wrong. But those consequences were not shared equally. The person who owned the farm might be remembered in a deed or later family history. The people who carried baskets, tended fire, cleaned vessels, handled salt, repaired doors, or checked food might appear only as labour, if they appeared at all. On some farms, that work belonged mainly to family members. On others, it involved tenants, hired hands, servants, free black workers, or enslaved people whose effort created winter security they did not control. A full cellar could still contain unequal access. A smokehouse heavy with meat did not mean every person nearby received the same portions. For tonight, though, we remain with the soft apple. It has been lifted from the bin and carried toward the stairs. The other apples settle into the small space it leaves behind. The lantern turns. The door opens briefly, admitting a strip of colder air. Nothing has been saved forever. One problem has simply been noticed in time. And before we follow the family toward the smokehouse, we need to understand how this underground room was built to borrow winter from the earth without allowing winter to enter too completely. The first thing the room borrowed was not cold. It was stability. At Oxon Hill in Maryland, a surviving brick root cellar built in 1830 was placed partly underground so the earth could help keep stored produce cool. It belonged to a substantial farm complex, surrounded by brick buildings that spoke of money, permanence, and labour already invested in the land. This was not a desperate hole scratched beside a cabin. It was infrastructure. Far to the west, the cellar at Lonely Dell near Lee's Ferry belonged to another landscape and another answer. In the late 1870s, the Johnson family's cellar was built, partly into the ground, with flagstone walls and an earthen roof. In that dry country, the room helped protect vegetables from winter freezing and offered cooler storage during hot seasons as well. Both spaces could be called root cellars. They did not look the same because the ground, climate, materials, and household circumstances were not the same. That difference matters more than any perfect definition. Above ground, temperature could swing from hard frost to weak afternoon sun and back again before supper. Wind found cracks, rain followed slopes. In some regions, summer heat mattered nearly as much as winter cold. A partly buried room changed more slowly than the air outside, and that slower movement gave stored food a better chance. The earth was not doing anyone a favour for free. At the unnamed farm we have been following, rain falls for 2 days before the harvest is fully stored. The slope above the cellar darkens. Water travels through soil in ways no builder can argue with. When the door is opened after the storm, a damp line has appeared near the floor. A basket was supposed to stand there. It does not stand there now. The person carrying the lantern puts it down, pulls the basket aside, and presses a hand against the wall. Cold, wet, or perhaps only cold enough to feel wet at first. The lantern is lifted closer. The darker stone answers the question. The manual remained dry. The cellar wall had chosen another approach. Before winter storage became a matter of apples and turnips, it was a matter of choosing ground. Dig too low in the wrong place, and water collected where baskets were meant to sit. Build against a slope without thinking about runoff, and the first heavy rain began testing the wall. Leave the doorway exposed, and cold air entered whenever it opened. Make the room too tight, and stale dampness settled around the food. A trench had to be cut. Stone, timber, brick, or packed earth had to be moved. Soil came out by shovel and basket. The floor needed to be firm enough to walk on and dry enough that stored food was not sitting in mud. If the walls were built poorly, frost, water, and pressure from the surrounding earth eventually made their opinions known. Some families could answer those pressures with brick, drains, heavy doors, and hired labour. Others understood what a better cellar required and still lacked the time or materials. Shelter, fields, fences, and livestock competed for the same hands. This is where written advice and lived history separate. A farm manual could describe a dry, cool, ventilated room with orderly shelves and carefully arranged produce. The description tells us what people considered desirable. It does not prove that every household achieved it. Real cellars inherited crooked ground, rushed labour, repaired walls, leaking corners, and doors that almost fit. Almost fitting is one of the great architectural traditions of ordinary life. The doorway deserved particular attention because it joined two climates. Outside was wind, snow, heat, rain, and sudden change. Inside was the slower atmosphere the household was trying to protect. A heavy door, a sheltered entrance, or a short enclosed passage reduced the shock when someone went in. Yet every trip still changed the room a little. A person descends with an empty basket. The latch sticks. Cold air follows boots through the opening. The lantern adds a little heat. The door stays open while someone chooses potatoes, onions, or roots for supper. Then it closes, and the room begins settling again. One visit seems harmless. Storage lasted for months, and months are made from harmless little events repeated many times. Air movement brought another difficulty. A sealed underground chamber could hold damp, stale air. A room with too much uncontrolled airflow became drier or colder than intended. Openings, vents, cracks, shafts, or doors helped move air, but their usefulness depended on weather and design. A cellar in Maryland did not face the same problems as a flagstone room in Arizona. Clay soil handled water differently from gravelly soil. A room beneath a building behaved differently from a detached cellar buried in a slope. The phrase root cellar makes all of these rooms sound like one object. They were local answers to local ground. That variation shaped what could be stored. The cellar was not a general underground cupboard where every food lived happily together. Different crops tolerated different conditions, and households learned through practice. Agricultural advice, inherited knowledge, neighbouring households, and disappointment. Shelves kept some items off the floor, bins contained others, barrels, boxes, baskets, straw, sand, or other packing material might be used depending on the crop, region, household, and period. Containers organised food, but they also made inspection harder. The apple at the top could look excellent while the one beneath it quietly reconsidered the arrangement. Wood absorbed moisture. Straw settled. Hinges stiffened. The cellar aged alongside the food. Autumn preparation, therefore, included cleaning and repair before storage began. Old plant matter had to be removed. Shelves and containers needed inspection. Evidence of pests mattered. A blocked opening or damaged door became more serious once the weather turned. The work required no dramatic machinery. It required time, which was often harder to obtain. One person scraped a shelf, another carried out debris, someone checked the wet line after the rain, a child held the lantern, while an adult shifted the basket to a drier place. More produce waited at the top of the steps because the harvest had already begun arriving. These scenes explain why survival systems were social systems. The room depended on hands, judgment, memory, money, materials, and authority. Someone decided which repair mattered. Someone supplied the labor. Someone controlled the tools. Someone else might later be praised for owning a well-managed farm. The walls rarely signed their names. The cellar did not solve winter by producing cold. It created a slower environment in which human attention had more time to act. Cold alone could destroy as well as preserve. If the room froze hard, some stored crops suffered. If it stayed too warm, change accelerated. If water entered, the family did not have a cellar so much as an extremely disappointing underground pond. And still, despite all of this, the room could work remarkably well. Not perfectly, not automatically, well enough. A household that chose its site carefully, built with the materials available, kept water out as best it could, managed the doorway, watched the air, and inspected the contents, had created something valuable. A place where the harvest could age more slowly than it would in the kitchen or outside. An ice house tried to save winter itself in blocks. A root cellar borrowed steadiness from the ground. The damp basket has been moved. The wall will be checked after the next rain. In the bin above it, the apples appear sound. Yet the question has only moved deeper, because once the room has been built, filled, and closed, the next problem is no longer the cellar. It is the fact that everything inside it is still alive. That life was quiet, but it did not stop. A potato lifted from the soil still carried the machinery of growth. An apple removed from the branch did not suddenly forget how to ripen. A cabbage cut from the field remained a bundle of living cells, using moisture, releasing a little heat, and moving slowly toward change. The cellar could slow those processes. It could not cancel them. This is why a full storage room was never a collection of finished objects. It was a room full of clocks. Some ran quickly. Some barely seemed to move. Some announced trouble with a smell. Others waited until a hand reached into a bin and found that the firm surface from last week had become soft. Picture a basket of potatoes near the wall. At first they are heavy, cool, and dull with soil. A few weeks later, one has begun pushing out a pale sprout. It is not making a dramatic escape. It is simply following the same biological instructions that once helped it grow underground. The household sees something different. A sprouting potato is food beginning to spend itself. The stored root contains energy. If it uses that energy to grow, the part intended for the table changes, texture suffers, quality declines. The cellar has not failed in one sudden moment. Time has simply become visible. Nearby apples follow another schedule. They soften. Their scent strengthens. A bruise darkens. One fruit may age faster because it entered storage already damaged. The hand sorting the bin does not need a scientific vocabulary to understand the pattern. It needs experience and enough attention to notice that one apple no longer belongs with the others. At Weir Farm in Connecticut, later records describe turnips and celery kept in a cellar setting, with turnips placed in sand. The detail is useful because it reminds us that storage depended on the crop and the household. One farm's bin of apples was another farm's sand-packed roots. There was no universal cellar menu. A modern refrigerator hides much of this work behind steady cooling, separate compartments, and the assumption that someone else has already sorted the food. In the cellar, judgment remains exposed. The person checking the stores reads the room directly. The eyes notice colour. The fingers test firmness. The nose becomes an early warning system, which is a respectable job, until a barrel of turnips gives it a promotion. Different crops created different problems. Some lost moisture and shriveled. Others held moisture so well that dampness gathered around them. Some were vulnerable to freezing. Some produced odours that made close neighbours less pleasant. Some could be stacked or packed. Others needed more space. This was not a pantry designed by matching labels. It was a negotiation among living things. A row of cabbages might look still beneath dim light, but the outer leaves changed first. Roots packed into a bin remained useful for weeks or months depending on the crop, the condition in which they entered, and the room around them. Apples that seemed perfect at harvest could reveal hidden bruises later. The best storage began before the cellar door closed. Harvest timing mattered. Rough handling mattered. A cut, crack, bruise, or damaged skin created a weak point. Produce intended for longer storage therefore had to be judged differently from food meant for tomorrow's meal. Imagine the sorting table in autumn. A basket lands with a wooden knock. Dirt falls through gaps between the boards. One person lifts each apple or root. The strongest pieces go toward longer storage. Damaged ones form another pile. That second pile is not automatically waste. Some will be cooked soon. Some may be dried, fed to animals, or used in another way before the damage deepens. What matters is separation. The household is deciding which foods can safely be asked to wait. Waiting was the whole purpose of the room. A root cellar did not make vegetables immortal. It gave the family more time between harvest and hunger. That time was unevenly distributed. A crop harvested carefully by an experienced hand had a better chance than one pulled in haste during bad weather. A household with enough labour could sort more thoroughly. A family with more bins and shelves could separate crops. A cramped household might place several kinds of produce close together because there was nowhere else for them to go. The difference between ideal storage and necessary storage could be the width of one shelf. Agricultural advice could sound wonderfully calm. Choose sound produce, avoid bruising, maintain suitable conditions, inspect regularly, all sensible. Also much easier to write while sitting at a desk than while rain is approaching, daylight is fading, and 3 more wagon loads of food still need somewhere to go. The household made decisions under pressure. Some crops came in early, others came late. A sudden frost forced work into one exhausting day. Wet produce needed attention before storage. Damaged items had to be identified. Containers had to be found. The cellar was not filled in one graceful scene. It accumulated basket by basket, bin by bin, and argument by argument over whether there was still room near the back wall. Once inside, every crop continued responding to its surroundings. A dry room pulled moisture from roots and left them lighter and less firm. Excess moisture encouraged other forms of deterioration. A warm spell outside changed the cellar slowly. A hard freeze near the doorway affected what sat closest to it. The household learned to read location as well as food. The cold corner, the damp shelf, the bin near the vent, the place where mice appeared last winter, the spot beneath the wall that needed checking after rain. The room became a map built from memory. That knowledge rarely entered official records in full. A farm account might list bushels stored or food consumed. It might record repairs, purchases, or losses. It was less likely to preserve the exact moment someone noticed that turnips lasted better in one part of the room, or that apples softened first beside a particular wall. Yet those moments were the practical science of household survival. Not formal experiments. Repeated observation. One season correcting the last. A mother, father, hired worker, child, tenant, servant, free labourer or enslaved worker might carry that knowledge, depending on the household and region. The person who knew where frost entered, or which bin failed first, possessed something valuable, even if the records never called it expertise. The cellar depended on remembered failure. That board warped last winter. Those potatoes sprouted too soon. The apples near the wall softened first. The door stayed open too long during the cold spell. The best lessons were often written in food that could no longer be eaten. Most visits to the cellar were not disasters. They were routine. A basket goes down empty and returns with supper. A few onions, several potatoes, a cabbage, perhaps apples chosen because they will not last as long as the others. The person closing the door looks once more at the shelves before lifting the latch into place. The room settles. Darkness returns. The vegetables continue their slow work. Above them, the household eats a meal that appears simple because months of labour have been hidden beneath the floor. And as the weeks pass, one truth becomes harder to ignore. Storing food is not merely a matter of keeping it cool. It is a matter of deciding, again and again, which pieces of autumn are strong enough to be carried further into winter. That decision began before anything reached the cellar. A basket of apples could look generous from across the room. Up close, it became a field of small judgments. One fruit had a split near the stem, another carried a bruise where it had struck the side of the basket. A third looked perfect until it was turned over and a dark patch appeared near the base. The household did not need every apple to be beautiful. It needed to know which ones could wait. The strongest fruit went toward longer storage. Damaged pieces were set aside for early use. Some might be cooked that evening. Some might become sauce, dried slices, vinegar, feed, or anything else the household could manage before the weakness deepened. Nothing about this looked like emergency work. No snow was falling indoors. No one was running. Yet this quiet table could decide how much food remained several months later. The same was true for roots. A potato cut by a tool, a turnip cracked during lifting, or a carrot broken while being pulled had lost part of its protection. Dirt on the surface was not necessarily the enemy. Damage beneath it was harder to forgive. So hands moved steadily. Lift, turn, press, separate. The rhythm was simple enough for a tired person to follow, and important enough that haste could become expensive. Outside, another basket arrives. Child or younger worker takes one handle, while an adult takes the other. Near the cellar steps, a boot slips in loose soil. The basket strikes a post hard enough to make the apples knock together. No skins appear split. The load is lifted again. There are still more baskets in the wagon. Daylight is shortening, and the work continues. The bruise has already begun. Days later, the fruit looks unchanged. Weeks later, one apple darkens beneath the skin. The pieces pressed against it grow damp where they touch. By the time the person checking the bin notices the stronger sweetness in the air, the stumble itself has disappeared from memory. The cellar remembers. One bad piece did not always ruin everything around it. Rot is not a theatrical villain with perfect timing. But damaged produce was more vulnerable, and close storage meant one neglected item could create trouble for its neighbours. That made the bottom of a bin more dangerous than the top. The upper layer was easy to inspect. The pieces beneath it lived in pressure, darkness, and forgetfulness. A person reaching down might feel only the first few rows and assume the rest was sound. Then, later, the smell changed. A hand moves deeper into the bin. Fruit near the bottom has softened. One apple has collapsed where its skin was damaged. The surrounding pieces are damp. What appeared orderly from above has been changing out of sight. Storage, therefore, became a question of arrangement. Bins held a great deal, but deep piles made inspection harder. Shelves improved access, but shelves required lumber, space, and construction. Barrels organized food neatly until the household needed the thing at the bottom, because barrels have always enjoyed turning simple meals into excavation projects. Cases solved one problem and created another. A basket allowed air through gaps, but offered less protection from drafts or rodents. A box kept produce together, but pressure accumulated if it was overfilled. Packing material might reduce bruising or moisture loss for certain crops, yet it could also hide deterioration. There was no arrangement that removed judgment. The household chose based on the food, the room, the available containers, and what past winters had taught them. Do not pile this too deeply. Keep that away from the damp wall. Use these first. Check the lower layer. Each instruction was the compressed memory of something that had already gone wrong. Perhaps apples had once been stored in one large bin because it saved space. By midwinter, the lower fruit had broken down before anyone noticed. The next autumn, the bin was divided. Perhaps potatoes near the entrance froze during a hard spell. The following year, that corner was left for something less vulnerable. Ordinary expertise often looks like superstition until the reason appears. The cellar taught through consequences. Produce harvested in wet conditions behaved differently from food brought in dry. A wagon jolting over uneven ground bruised what looked sound at first. Heavy baskets compressed the pieces below. Winter failure could begin on an autumn afternoon with one careless drop. This is why the people doing the work mattered. Skill was not limited to building the cellar or growing the crop. It lived in handling. An experienced person knew how full a basket could be before its weight damaged what it carried. They knew which roots could be brushed and which were better left alone. They also knew that a household could not spend forever inspecting every vegetable like a royal jewel. There was too much food and too little daylight. Sorting had to be careful enough to matter and fast enough to finish. That balance placed pressure on people whose work rarely survives in detail. A farm account might record a harvest quantity. It did not necessarily record numb fingers, an aching back, or the argument over whether one more basket could fit before dark. The numbers survive more easily than the hands. Class shaped the decisions as well. A household with surplus food could reject more damaged pieces. One living close to scarcity might store items that were less than ideal because imperfect food was still food. A wealthier farm could use several bins, shelves, barrels, and separate rooms. A poorer family might place everything into a cramped space and depend on frequent checking. Advice becomes different when waste is affordable. Use only sound produce is a tidy sentence. It becomes less tidy when the cracked turnips represent several meals. The family may use damaged pieces first, knowing that the strongest food must wait. This reverses the logic of abundance. The most attractive apple is not necessarily the first eaten. It may be protected for later, while the bruised one goes into tonight's pot. The winter table is shaped by weakness. What is most likely to fail is often consumed first. What is strongest is asked to wait in darkness. As the cellar fills, the room gains an internal order. One bin should be checked often. Another can wait longer. Food near the doorway faces more temperature change. Food beside the wall may need watching after rain. No label is required if everyone responsible remembers the system. And that creates another risk. Knowledge stored in one person is vulnerable if the person who understands the cellar becomes ill, leaves, or is occupied elsewhere. The room does not explain itself. Someone else enters and chooses from the wrong pile. A barrel intended for early use remains untouched. The best storing crop is eaten first. Damaged pieces wait too long. A system can fail without any wall breaking. Late in the evening, the sorting table is nearly clear. Sound fruit has gone below. Damaged pieces remain in a smaller basket near the kitchen. One apple is cut open. Beneath the bruise, the flesh is darker than expected, but much of it can still be used. The weak portion is removed. The rest becomes part of supper. Nothing has been wasted carelessly. Nothing has been guaranteed. Outside, the wagon is not empty. 6 baskets still wait in the fading light, and every one of them must be carried below before the cold settles harder into the ground. The 6 baskets became 5, then 4, then 3. From the yard, the cellar entrance did not look far away. A few steps, a door, a short descent. Distance changes when every trip begins with a load of roots, fruit, tools, or empty containers that must come back up again. A basket is lifted from the wagon. The handle presses into the palm. Potatoes settle against one another with a dull scrape. Someone walks carefully toward the steps because a stumble now means bruised food later. Then the descent begins. The first step is easy. The third is darker. By the fifth, the person carrying the basket can no longer see the floor without leaning around the load. A lantern waits below, or another pair of hands reaches upward to take some of the weight. This is the part hidden by the phrase, "the harvest was stored." Nothing in that sentence has sore shoulders. Nothing has mud on its boots. Nothing has to make the same trip 20 times before supper. On a farm with several able workers, the labour could be divided. One person brought produce from the field, another sorted it, someone else prepared containers. Children might carry lighter loads, hold a lamp, sweep debris, or bring damaged food towards the kitchen. In another household, fewer people did nearly everything. A woman who had already spent the day cooking, washing, tending children, feeding poultry, or helping with harvest work might still decide what entered storage and how it was arranged. An older child might learn the cellar through instructions that sounded simple because the adult had repeated the task for years. Put these near the wall. Not that wall. Use the cracked ones first. Do not leave the door open. And please do not drop the apples again, because history has already reviewed that experiment. The work required strength, but strength alone was not enough. The person carrying a basket also had to protect what was inside it. Move too quickly, and fruit struck the container. Fill it too heavily, and the lower pieces absorbed the pressure. Drag a barrel carelessly, and the floor or barrel might be damaged before winter had properly begun. So the labour had to be hard and gentle at the same time. That combination appears often in household work. Heavy objects must be lifted without breaking them. Fires must be fed without growing dangerous. Food must be handled quickly without being handled roughly. The work seems ordinary only because someone becomes skilled at it. At the cellar entrance, another person waits to receive the basket. The load passes between them. For a moment, both carry it. Then the person below turns toward the bins. The arrangement inside the cellar is already forming. Food meant for early use goes closer to the path. Longer storing produce is placed farther back. Items needing frequent inspection remain reachable. Nothing should block the doorway, shelves, or whatever opening helps the room breathe. This sounds obvious until the cellar begins filling. Space disappears faster than expected. A barrel sits where a basket needs to go. A bin that looked large in summer is suddenly inadequate. A shelf must hold more than its builder may have intended. One barrel has been placed by someone with great confidence and no intention of ever moving it again. Someone has to decide what shifts around it. That decision is about future meals. Place one crop behind another, and access changes. Put a heavy container in the wrong corner, and checking the wall becomes difficult. Store frequently used food too far back, and every visit disturbs the room more than necessary. The person making these decisions is organizing time. Tonight's food stays near. February's food goes deeper. The cellar becomes a calendar built from weight. The person who decides the arrangement is not necessarily the person carrying every load. The person carrying every load is not necessarily the person allowed to remove food later. On many family farms, those roles overlapped. On larger or more unequal properties, they could be sharply divided. A key, latch, or household rule turned stored food into controlled property. The cellar promised collective survival, but it also reflected authority. Who entered without asking? Who selected the best fruit? Who decided whether something had spoiled? Who received more when supplies ran low? Those questions rarely appear in the cheerful image of a full storage room. Yet fullness alone tells us little. A cellar containing hundreds of pounds of food may represent comfort for the owner, responsibility for the household manager, labour for the worker, temptation for the hungry child, and restricted abundance for the person who helped fill it but did not control it. One room can hold several versions of winter. The physical cost accumulated quietly. A basket does not become lighter because the person carrying it has already made 10 trips. The steps do not become wider. Cold air stiffens fingers. Damp wood becomes slippery. A rough handle finds the same sore place in the palm. By late afternoon, the work slows. Someone straightens their back at the top of the steps. Another pauses below, one hand resting on the edge of a bin. The lantern burns lower. Outside, fewer baskets remain, but the ordinary farm work has not disappeared. Animals need feeding. Tools need cleaning. Water must be carried. A meal must appear somehow, because people involved in preserving food remain inconveniently interested in eating it. This is why winter preparation could consume entire days without feeling complete. Every finished task revealed another one. The potatoes are down, but the apples still need sorting. The apples are placed, but the shelves need strengthening. The shelves are repaired, but damaged roots must be used before they worsen. The root cellar concentrated autumn's urgency into a small room. It also concentrated household knowledge. A child carrying light baskets begins to notice which bin is used first. A younger worker learns that the coldest corner is not always the best corner. Someone is corrected after placing onions where another food should have gone. The lesson may be delivered gently. It may arrive as a sentence sharpened by exhaustion. Either way, the cellar teaches through repetition. By the end of the season, the person who once needed directions may know which board creaks, which wall feels damp after rain, and which basket should never be filled to the top. This transfer of knowledge mattered because a storage system dependent on one person was fragile. Illness, injury, childbirth, absence, or exhaustion could remove the person who knew the arrangement best. Then the room became harder to read. A bin was opened too late. The wrong food was used first. A damp patch went unnoticed. The cellar's order existed partly in wood and earth, but partly in memory. Without that memory, the same room became less reliable. As evening settles, the final basket is carried down. It contains roots still marked with soil. The person at the bottom receives it, bends, and pours the load carefully into the remaining space. A few pieces roll toward the edge. One is caught before it strikes the floor. The empty basket returns upstairs. Below, the cellar looks full. That fullness appears calm only because the effort has ended for the moment. The room contains weight, but it also contains hours, the lifting, sorting, carrying, correcting, and deciding that made the arrangement possible. The door closes. Inside, the harvest begins its slow winter wait. And now that the room is full, every weakness in its climate has something valuable to damage. The rain returned 3 days later. It began gently during the night and continued through morning, darkening the slope above the cellar. By afternoon, water ran from the roof. The yard softened under boots, and the household remembered the wet line that had appeared beside the wall after the earlier storm. Someone went down before supper. The latch resisted. The door opened. The lantern found the same section of stone, now darker and wider than before. A wooden box resting nearby showed moisture along one edge. The room had no thermostat, only a family member touching the wall and hoping the wall had not developed plans. The box was moved first, then the basket beside it. A folded scrap of packing material beneath one container felt damp. The food itself appeared sound, but the arrangement no longer did. The cellar had borrowed coolness from the ground. It had also borrowed the ground's water. Nothing could be repaired properly that evening. The rain was still falling. The household could only move what was vulnerable, open a clearer path for inspection, and return after the weather changed. The next day remained wet. By the third, the clouds broke and the temperature rose unexpectedly. Weak sunlight spread across the yard. Snow or frost disappeared from exposed places. The change felt welcome outside. Below ground, the apple scent became stronger. The cellar changed slowly. But slowly was not never. Air near the entrance felt softer. One bin of potatoes showed more pale sprouts than it had the previous week. A root lifted from the upper layer bent more easily than expected. Warmth had not ruined the harvest. It had pressed on every clock inside it. The household adjusted again. The door was managed carefully. Food near the warmer entrance was checked. The damp packing material was removed. A lid was set aside to dry. The person responsible for the room made a new mental map. Wet wall, warmer steps, sprouting bin. Then the weather turned. A hard wind arrived from the north after sunset. By morning, water in shallow containers had frozen. The yard, soft 2 days earlier, was rigid beneath the first boot. The cellar door opened only briefly. Cold air entered low and fast, sliding across the floor. The box that had been moved away from the damp wall now sat closer to the entrance than usual. That had seemed sensible during the rain. It seemed less sensible now. A few roots along one side felt unnaturally hard. Not all of them, only the pieces nearest the draft. The basket was moved deeper into the room before anyone could debate the matter for long. This was how 1 week could redraw the cellar. Rain made one corner unsafe. Mild weather accelerated change near the steps of. A sudden freeze punished the temporary solution. The household was not managing 4 separate textbook problems called wet, warm, cold and dry. It was moving food through one unstable sequence in which every correction created a new arrangement. The earth buffered sudden changes, but it could not erase them. A cellar beneath a house behaved differently from a detached room in a slope. A deep cellar under steady snow cover differed from a shallow space beside an exposed door. Soil, drainage, construction, and local weather all shaped the result. This is why exact rules become dangerous when carried too far across time and place. Historical households were not operating one universal machine. They were adjusting particular rooms inside particular winters. The dry side of the problem appeared later. After several days of cold wind, the air in one section felt less heavy. A carrot lifted from a bin had begun to wrinkle. Another root felt lighter in the hand. The food remained usable, but it had lost moisture. Winter storage was not a contest between perfect freshness and complete failure. Most supplies passed through stages. A firm root softened, a smooth surface wrinkled. A sprout appeared. The household asked a practical question. Can this still contribute to a meal? A turnip did not need to win a prize. It needed to survive long enough to reach the pot. Managing air was part of that effort. Stale dampness could gather in one corner, while another section dried more quickly. Openings, cracks, vents, or the door allowed exchange, but every exchange connected the room to weather outside. The person checking the cellar used no precise instrument. They read the room by touch, smell, sight, memory, and comparison with the last visit. The wall is darker. The apples smell stronger. The roots near the door feel wrong. The container has shifted. The air does not sit the same way. This practical observation could be excellent and still remain imperfect. A cold stone could feel wet. A smell could be noticed late. A busy household could leave the cellar unopened for several days because someone was ill. An animal needed care, or firewood had become urgent. The room did not become more forgiving because the household was tired. This made attention another form of wealth. Not wealth counted only in coins or land, but in available hours, healthy bodies, shared knowledge, extra containers, dry lumber, and someone able to make one more trip down the steps. A damp wall is easier to manage when there is somewhere else to move the food. A frozen corner causes less damage when the cellar is not packed beyond reach. A cracked door is easier to repair when boards, tools, and labour are available. Poorer households did not fail because they lacked sense. They often had less room for correction. By the end of the week, the cellar had acquired a revised geography. The basket moved from the wet wall now sits deeper inside. The roots touched by the draft have been set aside for early use. The sprouting potatoes need closer watching. The damp packing material has been removed. Nothing has been solved forever. The arrangement is simply better than it was 3 days earlier. A person enters with an empty basket and leaves with supper. Moisture is wiped from one lid. A shriveled root is added to the kitchen pile. The door remains open only as long as necessary. For another day, the room has done enough. The family carries upstairs not a solution, but a revised set of habits. Check the wall after rain, keep the draft side basket deeper, and use the damaged roots first. But food was not the only thing learning the cellar's weak places. Behind the box moved during the rain. A narrow gap has been exposed where the wall meets the floor. Beside it lies a scatter of fresh gnaw marks. The marks were small enough to dismiss. A few pale curls of wood lay near the gap. One potato skin showed a narrow scrape. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The household blocked the opening with what was available, shifted the nearest box, and assumed the problem had been caught early. For 2 nights, the cellar remained quiet. On the third, a child sent down for onions heard scratching behind the lower shelf. The sound stopped as soon as the lantern moved toward it. The onions came upstairs. The warning did not. The next morning, someone returned with more time. The box moved during the rain was pulled farther from the wall. Behind it, the original gap appeared larger than expected. A mouse had not studied property law, but it had understood the floor plan. There were fresh marks along the baseboard and a few scattered seeds or fragments from packing material. The route did not lead directly into one bin. It passed behind several containers, which meant the household could no longer treat this as one damaged potato. Everything along the path had to be checked. The first box was lifted and found dry underneath. The second had a corner chewed lightly. The third was heavier and awkwardly placed. When it finally moved, the floor beneath it showed a darker patch. The rodent search had exposed another problem. Moisture had collected where the box sat close to the wall. Packing material near the bottom held dampness. 2 roots were soft where they touched it. One showed a pale patch of growth along a damaged surface. The cellar had arranged its troubles into a chain. Rain darkened the wall. The box was moved. The move exposed the gap. The gap revealed a rodent root. Following the route uncovered trapped moisture and failing food. Maintenance rarely respected categories. The household carried the affected roots toward better light. One was clearly beyond use. Another remained firm through most of its length and was placed with food intended for immediate cooking. The surrounding pieces were separated and checked. No one cheered. Another task had simply become visible. Rodents did not need to consume an entire bin to cause loss. They chewed food, damaged containers, disturbed packing material, and left contamination along the route they travelled. The difficulty was not always the amount eaten, it was the uncertainty spread around it. Which pieces had been reached? How far had the animal moved? Had it nested nearby? Was the blocked gap the only entrance? The questions mattered more in late winter, when every lost item represented a larger share of what remained. At this point, however, the cellar was still relatively full, and fullness made inspection harder. A box had to be emptied before its bottom could be examined. A barrel had to be shifted enough to see behind it. A deep bin concealed the lower layers. The very abundance meant to protect the household created hiding places for trouble. A trap was set near the wall. The route was blocked more carefully. Containers were raised or moved where possible. Loose food fragments were cleared from the floor. Then the household waited. The trap did not solve the cellar. It answered one question at a time. The next visit showed no result, but the bait had been disturbed. The visit after that revealed the animal. Another scratching sound later suggested that one mouse had not represented the entire population. Because history rarely ends a household problem with such admirable efficiency. The work repeated, but not in exactly the same way. One person checked the trap. Another examined the moved boxes. A child was reminded not to leave the door standing open. The damp packing was replaced or discarded. The wall was watched after the next thaw. And because the boxes had been moved, the household could now reach a section of floor that had not been cleaned properly since autumn. There, among dust and bits of straw, tiny insects moved near a split root. Insects presented a different pressure. Some arrived from outside, some came in with the harvest. Some became visible only after weeks in the sheltered room. Their presence might appear as holes, dust, webbing, movement, or damage that seemed too small to matter until several stored items showed the same sign. The split root was removed. Others nearby were inspected. The household could not identify every species or explain every stage of an insect's life. It did not need to. It needed to notice that the pattern had changed. This is how practical expertise operated. The normal room had a smell, a sound, and a settled appearance. A new scratch, a shifted lid, a sweeter odour. A damp patch or dust beneath a container told the experienced person where to look. A child could enter and notice nothing. Someone familiar with the cellar might pause before reaching the floor. That difference was knowledge, though records rarely called it that. Farm accounts preserved bushels, expenses, repairs, and occasionally losses. They seldom preserved the exact moment a worker recognised that a box had moved half an inch or that the apple smell had become too heavy near one wall. Yet the food depended on those observations. On a large farm, the person who knew the cellar best might be a servant, hired worker, tenant, free black labourer, or enslaved person whose name appeared incompletely or not at all. Ownership did not guarantee intimate knowledge. Daily work did. The room also depended on continuity. If the usual caretaker became ill or was pulled into other work, another person had to understand the new arrangement. The box near the damp wall has been moved. The roots in this basket should be used first. The trap is behind the shelf. Do not block the gap now being watched. The cellar had become a set of instructions written in objects. By midwinter, repairs and adjustments marked the room. A gap was packed with newer material. A box stood at an angle it had not occupied in autumn. One bin was shallower because damaged food had been removed. Empty spaces appeared where good food had become meals. The room no longer resembled the orderly place prepared before the freeze. It looked used. That was not failure. A successful cellar was not a museum. It was a working room in which food disappeared, containers shifted, surfaces stained, and decisions accumulated. One evening, the person with the lantern checks the trap and finds the bait untouched. The wall feels drier. No new marks appear beneath the box. The remaining roots in that corner feel sound. For the moment, the chain has stopped growing. The cellar door closes. Above ground, cold weather has settled more firmly over the farm. Another building stands ready at the edge of the yard. Its dark beams empty, its door still clean of the work about to begin. The household has spent weeks preserving food that remains alive. Now it must deal with food that will not wait in the same way. The smokehouse had been waiting through all of this. It stood beyond the cellar, often separate from the main house, small enough to seem unimportant and dark enough to invite later generations to imagine that smoke alone performed the miracle. It did not. Before anything could hang from its beams, the household had to confront a different kind of food and a different kind of clock. The roots below ground were still alive. They could sprout, dry, soften, freeze, or rot, but they remained plant tissue carrying on a slowed version of the processes that had begun in the field. Meat presented another problem. Once an animal was slaughtered, there was no living root waiting for spring. There was warm flesh, fat, moisture, and a much narrower window in which people had to act. The cellar had taught the household to slow change. The smokehouse demanded that the household change the food itself. That distinction altered the meaning of the entire winter system. Until now, the story has followed a room designed to borrow steadiness from the earth. Its power came from being cool, dark, enclosed, and watched. The smokehouse worked through exposure. Salt touched the meat, air moved around it, moisture had to leave, smoke entered the surface and filled the building. One space protected food by holding it near the conditions it preferred. The other protected food by making it increasingly unlike the fresh meat that had entered. Outside, the first sustained cold had arrived. The yard was firm beneath boots. Water left in a shallow container developed a skin of ice. Breath showed in the morning. The household had been watching for weather like this because cold could help make the difficult work of slaughtering and processing livestock more manageable. The date was not controlled by one universal calendar. Region, climate, animal condition, labour, and household practice all mattered, but colder weather often created the season in which large amounts of meat could be handled with less immediate heat pressing against the work. The smokehouse therefore began with weather, but it also began with preparation. Tools had to be ready. Containers had to be clean enough for their purpose. Salt had to be available. Fuel had to be gathered. Hooks, beams, cords, vessels, tables, and knives had to be found, repaired, or placed where they would be needed. Most importantly, people had to be present. A large animal could not be transformed into winter food by one elegant motion. The work was physical, repetitive, skilled, and time-sensitive. On some farms, family and neighbours worked together. On others, hired people, tenants, servants, free labourers, or enslaved workers supplied much of the labour. Communal settlements organised butchering and smoking on a larger scale. The details varied, but one fact did not. Preserved meat began with many hands. Later, a ham might hang quietly from a beam and look like a single object. Its quietness concealed the crowd. The smokehouse also concealed a mistake in the way modern viewers sometimes picture self-sufficient farms. A household did not simply walk from field to cellar and from livestock pen to smokehouse, independent of the outside world. Salt had to come from somewhere. Iron tools wore out. Barrels required coopers or household skill. Animals depended on feed, pasture, fencing, breeding, and health. Buildings required timber, stone, brick, labour, and repair. A winter food system could appear local while resting on roads, markets, trade, neighbours, and knowledge carried across generations and cultures. Even the techniques associated with smoking were not one invention belonging neatly to one group. European traditions, indigenous knowledge, African and African American practices, immigrant communities, and local environments shaped preservation differently from place to place. The building at the edge of the yard was local. The knowledge inside it had travelled. As activity began, the smokehouse door was opened. Inside, the room held very little comfort. There might be beams overhead, hooks, darkened surfaces, a hard floor, and evidence of earlier seasons. Soot clung where smoke had passed. Wood retained old odours. Light entered briefly through the doorway and failed to improve the atmosphere. The building did not need to be pleasant. It needed to support a process. Yet even the word smokehouse can make the process sound simpler than it was. Smoking was not always the first step, and it was not the only step. Meat might be salted, cured, drained, dried, hung, smoked, and stored in ways that differed by place, period, cut, weather, and household practice. The smoke was part of a chain. Remove the chain, and the building became a room full of confidence. That confidence could be dangerous. Fresh meat did not become dependable winter food merely because smoke touched it. Too much heat, too little control, poor preparation, insects, moisture, or unsuitable storage could undo the effort. A fire intended to create smoke could also become an ordinary fire, which was rarely the household innovation anyone had requested. So the smokehouse required its own form of watching. The cellar keeper read softness, sprouts, dampness, and smell. The person responsible for the smokehouse read surfaces, airflow, heat, smoke, time, fuel, and the condition of what hung above. Both relied on human senses. Both relied on memory. Both could fail quietly before failure became obvious. But the body paid differently in each place. The cellar demanded lifting, bending, carrying, cold fingers, and repeated descents. The smokehouse brought salt against cracked skin, heavy cuts of meat, smoke in the eyes, soot on clothing, long periods of tending, and an odour that followed a worker back into the house. Comfort at the winter table was created by people who had spent autumn and early winter being uncomfortable on purpose. Near the doorway, smoke begins to rise. It moves, curls, catches against the interior, and finds whatever path the building allows. The smell settles into beams already darkened by previous seasons. Outside, The cellar remains closed beneath the earth. Inside it, roots continue breathing slowly. Here, above ground, the household is beginning a different negotiation with time. One room asks living food to wait. The other asks fresh meat to become something capable of waiting. And this work did not always happen inside one family's yard. In places such as the Amana communities of Iowa, a village smokehouse could serve several kitchens, turning preservation into shared infrastructure rather than a private household task. The building might be larger and the labor more organized, but the biological deadline remained the same. Fresh meat did not become patient because the community was efficient. Before the smoke could do any useful work there or here, people still had to face the cold, heavy, urgent labor of butchering weather. The weather did not make the work easy. It only made delay less dangerous. A cold morning could slow some of the changes that heat would speed up, but it could not stop time. Once an animal had been slaughtered, the household had entered a narrow corridor of labor. Tools, water, tables, vessels, hands, and judgment all had to arrive in the right order. This was why butchering days were planned around more than temperature. People watched the sky. They considered how long the cold might hold. They counted the workers available. They checked whether salt had arrived, whether containers were ready, whether fuel was dry, and whether the smokehouse could be used when the meat reached that stage. A perfect cold day meant little if half the necessary equipment was missing. The yard became busy before sunrise. Water had to be carried and heated. Knives and other tools were prepared. Work surfaces were cleaned as well as the household could manage. Ropes, hooks, tubs, barrels, cloths and buckets appeared from sheds and storerooms. Nothing looked elegant. The arrangement reflected experience more than appearance. One object sat where a worker expected to reach for it. Another waited beside the next task. A missing vessel could slow several people at once. This was coordinated labor. On a small family farm, relatives and neighbors might gather because the work was too large or urgent for one household member. Assistance could be exchanged across farms. Help given this week might be returned when another family slaughtered its animals later in the season. Such cooperation reduced the burden, but it also created obligations. A neighbor who arrived in the cold expected the work to be organized. Food might be served. Favors would be remembered. News moved with the workers, because people remain people even while carrying heavy objects before breakfast. At Homestead in the Amana colonies of Iowa, the scale was different. A meat shop and smokehouse built around 1868 processed meat for several communal kitchens. Much of the butchering took place in fall and winter, and the smoking traditions carried knowledge from Westphalia into an American communal settlement. That one building opens the frame. Preservation could be household labor, neighborhood exchange, commercial work, plantation production, or communal infrastructure. At Amana, the animal did not move toward one private kitchen. It entered an organized system feeding several of them. The number of workers increased. So did the need for timing, storage, and specialist knowledge. Back in the smaller yard, the same principles appeared in rougher scale. Heavy work fell to those considered able. Experienced people handled decisions requiring precision. Women could play central roles in preparing, seasoning, curing, making sausages, rendering fat, cleaning, cooking fresh portions, and directing the use of parts that should not be wasted. Children carried messages, fuel, water, or lighter objects, and learned by staying near enough to observe. The exact division varied by household and region. What remained constant was that nearly every useful part created another task. Meat had to be separated and moved. Fat could be rendered. Fresh portions might be cooked sooner. Bones, skin, and other materials could have uses depending on local practice. Waste was expensive because the animal represented feed, fencing, care, risk, and time. The household was converting an animal that had occupied land and labor into a winter supply that could not be allowed to fail now. That history made haste necessary and care valuable. At Hampton in Maryland, surviving records place hog slaughter and butchering among winter agricultural work. They also show women holding major responsibility for producing hams and sausages. The record is useful because it interrupts the image of one male farmer handling the entire process while everyone else waits indoors. The work belonged to a system of bodies and skills. Free black labourers at Hampton also appear in account books performing tasks that included slaughtering and salting hogs. Some were paid by the day. Their names, classifications, and wages entered records shaped by the estate's hierarchy, but their presence makes the labour harder to hide beneath the owner's name. On plantations, enslaved workers carried out related work without freedom over their labour or the food produced. A cold butchering day could therefore contain cooperation, skill, wages, family obligation, coerced labour, or several of these at once depending on the property. The phrase American settlers is too broad to explain all of that. The yard makes the differences visible. Who arrives by choice? Who expects payment? Who owes a neighbour a future day of work? Who has been ordered there? Who will later control the meat? The cold touches every hand, but it does not make every position equal. Water that felt manageable at first becomes painful after repeated use. Metal tools remain cold even when labour warms the body. Boots collect mud, water, or slush depending on the ground. Clothing holds odours that follow people indoors. No graphic detail is needed to understand the physical reality. The body knows it through weight, temperature, repetition, and fatigue. A worker lifts one end of a heavy cut while another clears a path. Someone calls for a container. A child moves too slowly and is told, with the special patience adults reserve for urgent work, to move rather faster. Steam rises from heated water. Breath hangs in the air. The sun climbs without offering much warmth. Time becomes visible in the changing light. The household or work crew must keep the process moving because cold weather is assistance, not preservation by itself. A mild turn could shorten the margin. A delayed step affected what followed. This urgency explains why butchering weather was watched so closely. It was not simply a preference for uncomfortable mornings. Seasonal cold acted as temporary equipment before curing, drying, smoking, cooking, or other preservation steps took over. The air became part of the workplace. Weather could also become an unreliable worker. People read clouds, wind, frost, local patterns, and experience. They could still be wrong. A cold spell broke earlier than expected. Rain interrupted the yard. A sudden freeze made water, surfaces, and movement harder. The crew adapted without losing the sequence. Fresh portions intended for immediate use moved toward the kitchen. Other cuts began a longer journey. On a farm with livestock, good equipment, enough salt, and many workers, the day could create a substantial winter supply. On a poorer farm, the same labour yielded less. A household without enough animals could not smoke meat it did not own. One without salt, vessels, fuel, or secure storage faced tighter choices. Knowledge mattered. Resources determined how much room that knowledge had to work. By afternoon, the yard had changed. Empty vessels were now full. Tools had moved from one surface to another. Workers who began the morning speaking easily had become quieter. Fatigue shortened conversation. Cold mixed with the heat of labour. The preservation work was only changing shape. Heavy cuts rested in vessels or on prepared surfaces. The smokehouse door stood open for inspection. Fuel waited nearby. A worker rubbed sore hands together and looked toward the barrel that would decide what happened before anything reached those dark beams. The smoke may be the image later generations remember. But first came the salt. Salt entered the story long before the smoke. A barrel stood near the work area, plain and heavy, its surface marked by hands, damp air, and repeated opening. It did not look dramatic. Yet without enough salt, the smokehouse could become little more than a dark room waiting for a process that had never properly begun. That made salt more than seasoning. It was part of the household's winter infrastructure. The meat prepared after butchering still held moisture. Left alone, it would not wait patiently for spring. Salting and curing changed the conditions around it. helping draw out moisture and making the meat less welcoming to the forms of decay the household feared. The exact method varied by region, period, cut, household tradition, and available resources. Some meat was treated differently from other meat. Some practices used dry salt. Others involved brine or repeated handling over time. The process cannot be reduced to one universal frontier recipe, and none of it should be mistaken for safe modern instruction. Historically, one principle remains clear. The smoke did not begin the preservation work. The salt did. A worker reaches into the barrel. The crystals feel coarse against skin already cracked by cold, water, and labour. A heavy cut rests nearby. The salt is applied with care learned through repetition, not casually, not decoratively. This is not the moment when anyone is seasoning supper. The amount matters. The coverage matters. The condition of the meat matters. And because history enjoys placing precision inside tired hands, all of this takes place after a long day of physical work. Too little salt could leave meat inadequately prepared. Too much could make the final food extremely salty, hard, or difficult to use. The household worked within experience rather than a digital scale and printed label. This cut needs more attention. Turn that piece. Check the surface. Do not rush. Such knowledge passed through families, neighborhoods, workplaces, communal settlements, immigrant traditions, plantation kitchens, agricultural publications, and the unpleasant education offered by food that had failed before. The barrel contained more than salt. It contained a road. Perhaps the salt came by wagon from a town. Perhaps part of its journey had been made by river or canal. A merchant had purchased it, stored it, divided it, or extended credit for it. Someone had made the barrel, someone had lifted it onto a vehicle and then lifted it down again. The handful rubbed into the meat carried the wider economy into the farmyard. A household far from reliable markets faced different limits from one near a town or transport route. The price could rise, a shipment could arrive late, roads could become difficult, a family might conserve salt for preservation rather than use it freely at the table. So the smokehouse, often remembered as a symbol of independence, depended on a purchased substance that tied the farm to other people. Self-sufficiency, once examined closely, usually contains a merchant somewhere. The amount available affected what the household attempted to preserve and how confidently it could proceed. A prosperous farm might buy larger quantities and maintain suitable barrels, vessels, hooks, and buildings. A poorer family could possess the knowledge, but lack the material margin to use it fully. That difference was not a failure of intelligence. It was a shortage of options. The lid is lifted again. The barrel is not as full as it seemed yesterday. A woman or household manager responsible for provisions looks from the remaining salt to the meat still waiting. A worker familiar with curing understands immediately that the supply is tight. The owner of the livestock may see value in every cut without grasping how much material and labour are required to protect it. There is a pause. Winter arithmetic begins. How much meat can be treated? What must remain for later? Which cuts need attention first? What can be eaten fresh, shared, sold, or used in another way? The answers reveal household priorities, but Delivery 10 is not yet about who receives the final portion. It is about the material limits standing between knowledge and success. A family may know exactly what it wants to do and still lack enough salt to do it. The same was true of containers. Curing vessels had to hold heavy meat and liquid without failing. Barrels leaked, tubs cracked, lids warped. A vessel placed badly required people to lift weight through an awkward angle later. The work became quieter after the butchering day, but not easier in every way. A person enters a cold storage area in the morning. The vessel is uncovered. The smell is examined. A heavy piece is shifted. Liquid has gathered where gravity carried it. The hands return to the salt. This is the kind of labour that disappears easily from memory because no single moment looks heroic. It is maintenance again. Damp, repetitive, heavy, and necessary. The body carries the process. Salt enters cuts in the skin. Cold stiffens fingers. Large pieces resist being turned. Clothing absorbs odor. Floors become difficult to keep clean. A task expected to take a short time expands because one vessel is awkwardly placed or one cut is heavier than anyone remembered. The smokehouse waits outside, looking remarkably innocent. Curing required patience. But patience did not mean neglect. Time helped only when earlier steps had been done properly and conditions remained suitable. The household had to resist haste and false confidence. Smoke could not correct every earlier mistake. That is important, because later images give smoke almost magical power. A darkened beam, a hanging ham, and a curl of blue-grey smoke make a complete visual story. The actual story is longer. It begins with raising the animal. It continues through feed, fencing, labour, slaughter, cutting, salt, vessels, cold weather, handling, and waiting. Only then does the smokehouse receive what has been prepared for it. By the time a cured piece leaves its vessel, it has already passed through several hands and decisions. It is lifted, inspected, and carried toward the building at the edge of the yard. The door opens. Old smoke remains in the wood. Hooks and beams wait overhead. The room is dim, dry compared with the cellar, and stained by previous seasons. The person carrying the meat looks upward. The next stage will depend on where the piece hangs, how air moves around it, how smoke travels through the room, how the fire is controlled, and how patiently someone returns to check all of it. The salt has bought time. Now the smokehouse has to use that time without burning the whole arrangement down. The danger was not dramatic at first. A small fire sat low in the smokehouse, controlled enough to produce smoke without turning the building into a proper blaze. Above it, cured meat hung from beams or hooks, separated as well as the space allowed. The door closed, and the room became dim again. Smoke moved slowly. It curled around lower walls, rose past darkened boards, gathered beneath the roof, and found whatever openings the structure offered. It touched the hanging meat, the beams, the hooks, the clothing of anyone who entered, and almost everything stored nearby. That movement mattered, because a smokehouse was not merely a box filled with smoke. Air had to travel, fuel had to smoulder rather than flare, meat had to hang where smoke could reach it, and someone had to return often enough to notice when the room began doing something unexpected. There was no single American smokehouse design. At the Sauer Beckman farm in Texas, a limestone smokehouse built before 1900 used its lower floor for smoking meat and its upper floor for storage. It was not a tiny wooden cabin, it was a masonry building with more than one level and more than one function. At Homestead, in the Amana colonies, the meat shop and smokehouse served several communal kitchens. The building belonged to a larger system of shared food production rather than one private family's yard. In Hermann, Missouri, a smokehouse dating to around the middle of the 19th century survives as another regional example. Different materials, different scale, different community, same broad need to manage valuable meat over time. These buildings should not be forced into one picture. Step inside the limestone building at Sauer Beckman in imagination. The lower room holds the smoking work while stored provisions occupy the level above. Heat, odour, and risk are being managed vertically as well as across the floor. A worker climbing or descending between those uses would not experience the building as one simple chamber. A small timber room, a limestone structure, and a communal processing building created different internal conditions: size, wall material, ceiling height, beam placement, openings, and smoke source changed how the interior behaved. Even within one building, smoke did not move evenly. A piece near a wall received different exposure from one nearer the centre. A lower cut sat closer to heat. An upper beam collected smoke and soot over years. Drafts entered through cracks, doors, or deliberate openings according to the construction. The person checking the room learned its geography. This hook sits too near the heat. That corner draws more air. Smoke gathers heavily beneath this beam. Opening the door changes everything for a moment. A worker steps inside and looks upward. The meat is not examined as decoration. Surfaces, odour, dryness, smoke, and the condition of the fire require attention. One piece may need shifting. Fuel may need adjustment. The work is repetitive, which makes it vulnerable to interruption. Someone is called away. An animal escapes a pen. A child becomes ill. Snow begins falling heavily. A tool breaks elsewhere on the farm. The smokehouse continues operating through all of it. That was part of the risk. Fire does not become less interested in timber because the household has other responsibilities. Keeping smoke without creating destructive flame required care. Dry fuel could catch too quickly. Wind altered the draft. Sparks travelled. A poorly maintained building exposed nearby wood or stored material to danger. The safest smokehouse was often separate from the main dwelling for a reason. If something went wrong, distance offered at least a little protection. It also created inconvenience. Every inspection required a trip outside, in rain, snow, darkness, or wind. Someone left the warmth of the house, crossed the yard, lifted the latch, and entered a room smelling of old smoke and current work. The path packed down under boots. The door grew cold beneath the hand. Snow collected against the wall. Inside, the person checked whether the fire was still behaving like a servant rather than applying for ownership of the building. Smoke entered the eyes and throat. It settled into hair and wool. Clothing carried the odour indoors, where no one needed to ask what task had just been completed. So did soot. A hand touching the beam came away dark. A hook left a mark. Walls grew more stained with each season, turning the building into a record written in smoke rather than ink. Those stains are part of why surviving smokehouses appear atmospheric today. At the time, atmosphere was not the objective. Preserving valuable food was. A household had invested livestock, feed, labour, salt, time and physical effort into what now hung overhead. Losing it to fire, insects, poor preparation, moisture or neglect meant losing far more than one meal. The meat represented breakfasts, stews, flavouring, fat, hospitality, work meals, and reserves for days when fresh food was scarce. That value attracted pests. Insects reached hanging meat. Rodents sought anything stored lower or left vulnerable. The building needed watching long after the first smoke rose. The Zauer-Beckmann structure reminds us that the upper room might hold other provisions as well. A building called a smokehouse could become a mixed storage space, which meant the risks inside were not limited to meat. No device removed the need for inspection. That inspection could begin before the door opened. A worker crossing the yard watched the smoke leaving the roofline or cracks. Was it moving as expected? Was it thicker than yesterday? Had the wind changed? The first reading of the room happened outside, with cold air on the face and the smell reaching the path. A worker opens the door near evening. Outside light forms a pale rectangle on the floor. Smoke slips toward it. Above, the meat hangs in dark rows. Nothing appears obviously wrong. That is reassuring, but not final. The fire is checked. One hook is shifted. A hanging piece is moved slightly so air can pass more freely around it. The worker waits long enough to see whether the smoke resumes its usual path. Only then does the door close again. By now, the cellar and smokehouse are doing opposite work in the same winter. Below ground, moisture is being preserved carefully enough to keep roots useful. Above ground, moisture is being reduced and controlled around meat. The household has created two environments with no machine more advanced than walls, openings, fuel, salt, earth, and human attention. It is impressive. It is also exhausting. And whether the building is timber, limestone, brick, or part of a communal complex, one question remains outside architecture. The meat may be hanging safely. Who controls what comes down? The answer was not always the person who had done the work. A worker might know which ham had been hung first, which hook sat in the driest part of the room, and which piece needed attention before the others. That did not mean the worker could cut from it whenever hunger appeared. The smokehouse was a preservation building, but it could also be a locked storehouse. A latch, key, household rule, or simply the authority of one person determined when the door opened and what came out. The meat overhead represented months of animal care, slaughter, purchased salt, gathered fuel, and repeated labour. Taking down a piece was not merely choosing supper. It was spending part of the household's future. On a small family farm, that future might be discussed around the table. The household knew how many people had to be fed, which cuts were intended for ordinary meals, and which were being saved for visitors, illness, heavy work, or the leanest part of winter. Even there, authority was not perfectly shared. An older household head might control the key. A woman managing daily food could understand the supply better than the person who legally owned it. Children might be sent to fetch something, but not allowed to choose. A hired hand might eat at the table while having no say over what entered the pot. That decision-maker had to think beyond appetite, cut into the best meat too early, and later meals became poorer. Save everything too carefully, and food might be lost before it was used. Serve generous portions during a celebration, and the absence remained visible weeks afterward. Preservation created time. Rationing decided how that time was spent. A person enters with a knife, cloth, basket, or hook. Breath shows near the open door. Above, several pieces hang in shadow. Which one comes down? The choice may depend on age, condition, size, household custom, or the meal planned upstairs. It may also depend on status. A better portion could be reserved for the owner's table. A less desirable piece might go toward workers' meals. A small quantity could flavour a large pot rather than appear as a separate serving. Fat, bone, broth, vegetables and grain stretched preserved meat across more people and more days. This was practical cooking. It was also a map of power. At Hampton in Maryland, estate records make that map unusually concrete. Women held major responsibility for producing hams and sausages. Free black labourers appear in account books, performing work that included slaughtering and salting hogs. In some entries, workers were paid 50 cents a day for butchering. The ledger gives us a name, a task, and a wage. It does not give us the cold in the fingers, the smell in the clothing, the weight of the meat, or the full relationship between the worker and the household buying the labour. Records preserve what the record keeper needed. They also classify people through the estate's hierarchy. Black workers could be indexed differently from white workers doing related labour. The page is evidence, but it is not neutral glass. It tells us that skilled work occurred. It tells us payment could be made. It tells us race shaped how the work was recorded. It does not make every worker equally powerful inside the food system. On plantations, enslaved people could raise livestock, maintain pens, perform slaughter, prepare meat, apply salt, tend smoke, repair buildings, cook meals, and preserve the winter supply while the animals, structures, tools, and preserved food were legally owned by enslavers. A smokehouse full of meat did not represent shared abundance. Its contents could feed the enslaver's family, guests, or commercial interests, while enslaved workers received controlled rations or inferior portions. Conditions varied across place and time, and surviving evidence is uneven, but the ownership relation was not uncertain. The people creating food security were not free to claim its full benefit. That fact changes the appearance of the building. The dark beams show practical skill. They also show how preservation supported a system in which labour and reward were deliberately separated. The absurdity belongs to the institution that treated expert human labour as property while recording the resulting hams as evidence of the owner's prosperity. A farm ledger might list animals slaughtered. An inventory might assign value to barrels, hooks, buildings, salt, or cured meat. A household account could mention provisions served to guests. The people who spent hours in smoke, cold, grease and salt might appear only as a category, a first name, an age, a wage, or not at all. The meat receives a number. The worker receives whatever the archive happened to preserve. On tenant farms, authority took another form. A family might perform the work and consume much of the food while still living under obligations to a landlord, merchant, or creditor. Livestock, rent, debt, and access to land shaped how much remained under household control. If meat had to be sold to meet an obligation, the smokehouse could be full one week and noticeably lighter the next. If a merchant had extended credit for salt or tools, preservation already carried a financial claim. The door protected the meat from weather and animals. It did not protect it from debt. Within the family, gender shaped who knew and who decided. Women frequently carried major responsibility for food management, curing work, sausage making, fat rendering, cleaning, cooking, and stretching preserved supplies across meals. Their practical authority could be extensive, even when legal ownership rested with a husband, father, employer, or enslaver. A woman might know exactly how much remained. She might also be expected to make shortage invisible. When supplies narrowed, the meal changed before the household admitted that winter had become difficult. More vegetables, more grain, a smaller piece of meat, a pot that cooked longer and served more bowls. The smokehouse could look unchanged from outside, while the kitchen quietly absorbed scarcity. Children learned the hierarchy through these meals. They noticed which foods appeared on Sundays, which were saved for guests, and which portions belonged to adults doing heavy work. They learned whether the smokehouse door opened freely or only with permission. A child might know where the key was kept, and still understand that touching it would create a household event of unnecessary size. By late winter, the rules tightened. Empty hooks appeared between the remaining pieces. One ham might be reserved, another had already been cut several times. A smaller piece needed to be used soon. Yet ownership and authority could not guarantee that the meat remained sound. The key controlled human access. It could not command moisture, insects, mold, fat, temperature, or time. A valuable piece might hang untouched because someone was saving it. The person who finally took it down might notice a smell, surface, texture, or mark that had not been there before. Then the question changed. It was no longer who had permission to use the food. It was whether the food could still be used at all. The building at Melrose in Mississippi still carries the name Smokehouse. The name invites a complete picture. A fire below, meat hanging overhead, salt worked into heavy cuts, ash on the ground, generations of smoke darkening the interior. The physical evidence does not cooperate. No expected traces of salt or ash were found beneath the structure. The estate did not raise hogs or beef cattle there in the way the traditional story would require. The building may have served primarily as food storage rather than as a place where meat was smoked. The name survived. The expected residue did not. That difference creates a late problem for anyone trying to understand root cellars and smokehouses through surviving buildings alone. A structure can keep a label long after its use changes. Family memory can sharpen one function and forget another. A later owner can repeat a name until the name begins behaving like proof. History has its own form of spoilage. An interpretation can remain on the shelf long after the evidence beneath it has changed. The Melrose building does not make smokehouses imaginary. It makes source boundaries necessary. At Sauer Beckman, the limestone building, interior arrangement, and farm tradition support smoking and storage. At Amana, the communal meat shop and smokehouse belong to a documented processing system. At Melrose, the expected physical traces are missing. A careful script must allow those differences to remain differences. The same discipline applies when food itself fails. A household entering the smokehouse might carry a name for what it expected to find. A sound ham, a cured side, winter meat reserved for later. The label in the mind did not guarantee the condition in the hand. A piece is taken down and carried toward better light. The surface looks different near one edge. The odor is not the ordinary mixture of salt and smoke. Fat has changed. An insect mark appears where none was noticed before. The people examining it do not have laboratory testing or modern refrigeration to settle the question. They have sight, smell, touch, experience, local practice, and the memory of earlier food. Sometimes the answer is obvious. sometimes it is not. That uncertainty is where scarcity presses hardest. No one wants to waste meat representing feed, labour, salt, fuel, and months of care. No one wants to make the household ill. The safest choice can also be the hungriest choice. A prosperous farm with several pieces still hanging can discard questionable food more quickly. A household looking at its final reserve hesitates longer, not necessarily from ignorance, but because every alternative has already narrowed. The same tension returns below ground. After a thaw, the cellar keeper opens a bin near the wall that has caused trouble before. The upper roots look acceptable. Beneath them, packing material has held more moisture than expected. Several roots have softened where they touch. One is removed, then another. The basket meant for supper begins filling with loss. Spoilage does not destroy only food. It destroys plans. This bin was expected to last through several more meals. That hanging piece was being saved for a difficult week. A crock, barrel, or sack occupied a place in the household's imagined future. When it fails early, the future must be rewritten. A larger piece of meat may be cut sooner than intended. Grain may replace vegetables. A neighbour may be approached for exchange. An animal may be slaughtered at an inconvenient time. Food may be purchased on credit if a market can be reached and trust or money remains available. The root cellar and smokehouse reduce dependence on winter travel. Neither returns that dependence quickly. Roads can be frozen, flooded, blocked by snow, or simply long. Stores do not guarantee stock. Prices rise. A farm remembered as self-sufficient may spend a difficult week waiting for a wagon carrying flour, salt, or another basic provision. The romantic farmstead becomes less independent when the road closes. Fire creates a faster form of loss. A smokehouse relies on controlled heat or smoke. Uncontrolled can fail. A spark reaches dry material. Fuel flares. A worker crossing the yard notices that the smoke looks heavier or moves differently from usual. The door is opened carefully. The quiet maintenance system becomes urgent. Water has to be carried. Fuel is disturbed or removed. Hanging food may be shifted. Heat, flame, smoke, water, or the rush to protect the building can damage what people spent weeks preparing. Even a small incident consumes time, weakens timber, ruins food, or frightens everyone involved. A larger fire can take the whole structure and threaten nearby buildings. This is why the separate smokehouse makes sense despite the inconvenient walk. Distance charges the household in cold steps, but it can keep one dangerous process from sharing a wall with sleeping people. Pests remove value more slowly. An insect mark on one hanging piece leads to examination of the others. A rodent reaches something stored lower. A cover has shifted. A latch shows no human entry, yet something inside has clearly been dining without permission. Food is moved. Surfaces are checked. Openings are blocked. No single loss needs to be catastrophic. Accumulation is the danger. Several apples. A layer of roots. One portion of meat. Grain reached by mice. A crock cracked by freezing. A barrel leaking at the bottom. Winter reduces the household through subtraction. The records do not preserve every subtraction. Inventories capture what remained at a particular moment. Accounts record purchases, wages, or large losses. They rarely tell us about every soft apple carried upstairs, every questionable smell, or every meal changed because one expected food had to be discarded. Buildings preserve unevenly too. Walls survive. Hooks disappear. Floors are replaced. Soot is cleaned away or never forms strongly in the first place. A family name remains attached to a room whose use changed several times. Archaeology gives us material traces, repairs, stains, objects, and absences. It does not always give us the worried conversation at the doorway. This is why the absence beneath the Melrose building matters. No ash, no expected salt residue, no livestock system matching the traditional label. The missing evidence does not prove every detail of the building's use, but it prevents confidence from filling the gap too easily. The same humility belongs in the cellar and smokehouse scenes. We can explain how these systems worked. We cannot pretend every household succeeded, every building served one purpose, or every remembered story describes ordinary practice. By the end of winter, such distinctions become less academic. The cellar bins are lower. The smokehouse beams hold wider spaces between hanging pieces. Each damaged item represents a larger share of what remains. A person enters the cellar with a lantern and pauses before the nearest bin. The smell is ordinary. The troublesome wall is dry enough. No fresh marks appear near the floor. For once, there is no new problem. But the absence of failure does not bring abundance back. The room is working. The food is simply running out. And the final test of the entire winter system will not come during the first snow or the hardest freeze. It will come in the thin weeks before spring, when every remaining root, strip of meat, and handful of grain must be asked to last a little longer. The thin weeks were rarely the coldest, but they could be the hardest. By then, winter had lost some of its drama. Snowbanks had settled. The sharpest storms might have passed. Daylight lingered a little longer near the windows. Yet fields remained unready. Roads could still be poor, and nothing new had begun growing fast enough to matter. Inside the cellar, the wooden bottoms of bins had started to appear. At first, only a narrow strip showed between potatoes. A week later, the gap widened. Apples that once formed several layers now sat in one uneven row. A barrel that had seemed impossibly deep in autumn could be searched with one hand. The room had not failed. It had been eaten. That distinction mattered, because an emptying cellar was both reassuring and frightening. Every missing root represented a meal successfully carried through winter. It also represented one less meal remaining. The household could read the season by the spaces between objects. A full shelf meant October confidence. A half-empty bin meant January calculation. Bare boards meant spring had better begin considering its responsibilities. The quality of what remained had changed. Even good storage could not prevent months from passing through the food. Apple skins wrinkled, flesh softened, roots bent more easily. Potatoes showed sprouts that required attention. The food was not necessarily useless. It was older. This changed the kitchen. A softened apple might be less pleasant in the hand, but useful in a cooked dish. A root no longer appealing by itself could disappear into a pot with grain, broth, fat, or meat. Tougher textures yielded to longer cooking. Small quantities of preserved meat gave flavour to food carrying most of the volume. The winter table became skilled at making less look complete. A pot sits near the fire. Vegetables enter first, then grain. A small piece of meat is cut more carefully than it would have been in November. Fat clinging to it matters. Bone matters. The cook knows how much water can be added before supper begins tasting like a rumour. Nothing in the pot is accidental. The meal is the household's remaining calendar. Rationing did not always begin with a formal announcement. It entered through smaller changes. Slices became thinner. The smokehouse door opened less often. The best apples were reserved for someone ill, very young, very old, or expected to perform heavy work. A ham that might once have supplied a generous serving now flavoured several meals. These choices revealed what the household valued and who held authority. Scarcity did not erase rank. Sometimes it sharpened it. On a small farm, everyone might experience the same narrowing menu, though not in equal portions. In a tenant household, rent or debt could already have removed part of the harvest. On a plantation, a smokehouse still holding substantial meat for the enslaver's household did not guarantee adequate rations for the enslaved people whose work helped fill it. A building's fullness could conceal hunger nearby. This is why an inventory listing barrels, roots, grain and cured meat cannot tell us that every person on the property could reach them. Access remains a separate fact. So does reputation? Farm families lived among neighbours who noticed success, decline, generosity and need. Asking for food, credit, or help could carry embarrassment, obligation, or both. Sharing provisions strengthened relationships, but it also created a memory that might return during another season. One household sends over a basket of roots. Another lends flour. A neighbour provides meat in exchange for labour promised later. No one calls it a rescue, if a quieter word will do. Rural survival depended on this web of exchange. The cellar and smokehouse reduced vulnerability, but they did not remove the farm from its community. A poor harvest, sick worker, broken wagon, lost animal, or failed batch of preserved food could make another household's surplus suddenly important. The myth of complete self-sufficiency becomes difficult to maintain once supper has a neighbour's name attached to it. The household examines its stores repeatedly. A person descends into the cellar and counts without writing. 6 apples, a small layer of potatoes, several roots in the back bin, 1 cabbage that should be used soon. The numbers live in memory because they must be compared with the days ahead. Up in the smokehouse, the same arithmetic continues. 1 hanging piece remains untouched. Another has been cut several times. A smaller portion is moved closer to the door because it will be used next. Empty hooks form dark shapes against the beams. The person looking upward sees intervals between meals. This is where preservation and rationing meet. It is not enough for food to remain usable. It must remain available at the correct pace. Eat too freely, and the supply ends before the season changes. Hold back too strictly, and food may deteriorate while people go without. The ideal point lies somewhere between waste and hunger, which is a wonderfully precise target to locate in a smoky building by lantern light. Experience helped. So did luck. A mild spell disturbed cellar conditions. A late freeze delayed planting. Livestock feed could run low. Winter did not end because the calendar became encouraging. It ended when the household could obtain dependable new food. Until then, every remaining store carried more importance. The last apples were not simply fruit. They were distance. The remaining ham was time. The roots at the bottom of the bin were a bridge between a finished harvest and a field that had not yet begun again. For the person managing meals, this bridge had to be crossed slowly. A week of guests, illness, or heavy labour changed the calculation. 1 spoiled container removed several days of expected food. Meals narrowed, but they also became inventive. Broth was stretched, bread absorbed liquid and flavour. Vegetables were combined according to condition rather than preference. The softest food went first. The strongest pieces waited. Nothing was thrown away casually, though not everything could be saved. By the late 19th century, iceboxes were changing expectations in some American households, and electric refrigeration would transform them more thoroughly in the 20th. By the 1930s, domestic refrigerators were becoming a far more important part of American life. But those machines do not enter this cellar tonight. Here, cold still comes from the ground. Judgment still comes from the person holding the lantern. And spring remains the only dependable replacement for autumn. The cellar no longer smells like abundance. Its odours are lighter. Air moves through larger spaces. Footsteps sound different because fewer containers absorb the noise. The lantern reaches farther across the room. The person carrying it can see the back wall without moving a barrel. That visibility feels almost wrong. The room is returning to itself. Earth, boards, shelves, stains, and the few objects still being asked to wait. 1 root remains firm beneath a layer of softer ones. It is lifted, inspected, and placed back. Not tonight. Perhaps tomorrow. Outside, water begins dripping from the roof during the warmer part of the day. The yard softens at the edges. The smokehouse stands with fewer reasons to open its door. Spring is near. But near is not food. The household still has to cross the remaining days, and when the cellar door opens one final time, the meaning of its emptiness will depend on whether those last stores have lasted just long enough. The final visit began with water dripping from the eaves. Not a steady rain, just the soft, uneven sound of thaw working through the roofline. The yard had lost some of its winter hardness. Mud appeared at the edges of the path. Snow withdrew from the south side of the buildings and left dark ground behind. Spring had not arrived in any useful sense, but it had begun making promises. A person crossed the yard with an empty basket and opened the cellar door. The latch felt less cruel beneath the hand than it had in January. The air inside was still cool, carrying earth, old wood, and the faint remains of apples, onions, and roots. Yet the room felt larger now. Most of the food was gone. The lantern no longer revealed abundance. It revealed shelves. A nearly empty bin. A barrel standing open. Straw pressed flat where fruit had once rested. The back wall, hidden through autumn and winter, could now be seen without moving anything. This was the moment when an empty cellar could mean two opposite things. It could mean hunger had arrived before spring, or it could mean the room had worked almost exactly well enough. The difference might be one basket, 1 week, one late storm, one surviving root. A hand reaches into the final bin and moves aside several pieces that have softened. Beneath them lies a firm turnip or rutabaga, rough-skinned and unimpressive. Soil remains caught in one deep crease. It does not look like the conclusion to a heroic survival story. That is probably why it belongs there. The root is lifted and examined in the lantern light. Months earlier, it had been pulled from cold ground, sorted, carried down narrow steps, checked through damp spells, protected from freezing, and left behind while weaker food was eaten first. It has survived by being ordinary and strong. The person places it in the basket. A few other usable roots follow. Not many. The cellar is not completely empty, but every object can now be counted without effort. That simplicity has been purchased gradually, meal by meal, basket by basket, loss by loss. The room has not created food. It has slowed the disappearance of food that already existed. Its success depends on how long that slowing remained useful. Upstairs, the roots will be cut and cooked. Their texture may be rougher than it was in autumn. Their flavour may be less bright. No one mistakes them for fresh harvest. They do not need to be fresh. They need to be present. That was the practical meaning of preservation. Presence at the right moment. The cellar door closes again with less urgency than before. The basket crosses the yard toward the house. Nearby, the smokehouse stands quiet. Inside, the beams remain dark with soot from seasons of smoke. A few hooks hang empty. One may still hold a final piece reserved for later use. The room smells of work that has already happened. Old smoke remains in the wood after the fire is gone. Salt marks a barrel. A cord hangs loose. The floor carries ash, dust, and the evidence of repeated entry. Like the cellar, the smokehouse now reveals its structure because its contents have disappeared. The meat did not vanish all at once. It entered stews. It flavoured beans and grain. It became portions for heavy work days, visitors, illness, celebrations, and meals divided according to the household's rules. Every empty hook is another set of decisions. A surviving bean cannot tell us every name connected to it. It does not explain which worker tended the smoke, which woman stretched the meat across meals, which tenant surrendered part of a supply to debt, or which enslaved person preserved food controlled by an enslaver. The silence in the room remains part of its history. That is why the root cellar and smokehouse should not be remembered only as clever buildings. They gathered weather, labour, land, trade, knowledge, authority and risk into small physical spaces. The cellar depended on earth, drainage, walls, doors, containers, and careful handling. It depended just as much on the person who recognised a changed smell before damage spread. The smokehouse depended on salt, fuel, airflow, beams, hooks, and controlled smoke. It also depended on the worker, who returned in bad weather to make certain the fire remained useful rather than destructive. Neither room operated alone. A road carried salt, a cooper made a barrel, a neighbour lent labour, A child carried a basket. A household manager changed the meal when the stored supply narrowed. Knowledge travelled across families, regions, and cultures before it entered either building. The image of self-sufficiency becomes less lonely when those connections return to the frame. Outside, thaw water continues falling from the roof. The soil is still cold, and seed has not become supper. A late freeze may punish anyone who trusts the sunlight too quickly. But the direction of the season has changed. The household is no longer protecting abundance from the beginning of winter. It is carrying the last fragments of abundance toward renewal. The final root enters the kitchen. A knife strikes the board and meets one tougher patch before passing through. The rough skin is removed. Inside, the flesh is pale and firm enough. Water begins heating. Grain or other vegetables may join the pot. A small piece of preserved meat may be added, if one remains and if this is the day chosen for it. The meal will not look impressive. It will look like food. That is enough. Marcina earlier, the household stood between a harvested field and an approaching freeze. There were too many baskets, too little room, too much work, and no guarantee that the stored food would remain useful. Now the cellar is nearly bare. The smokehouse is mostly still. The bins, shelves, beams, and hooks have reached the quiet end of their purpose. Their emptiness does not erase failure. Food spoiled. Pests entered. Weather shifted. Access was unequal. Some households possessed stronger buildings, more land, more livestock, and greater margins than others. These structures did not make settlers invulnerable. They made certain forms of survival more possible. That is a smaller claim. It is also the more impressive one. With no electric refrigeration, households created temporary environments from earth, timber, stone, brick, salt, smoke, cold air, and remembered experience. They did not stop biological change. They worked around it. They did not defeat scarcity. They organized it. They did not conquer winter. They negotiated with it every day. The cellar door is closed once more. The latch settles into place. There is little left inside except empty containers, flattened straw, cool air, and the smell of earth. Across the yard, old smoke rests in the beams of the quiet building. Between those two rooms, an entire autumn has been consumed. And somewhere in the kitchen, the last firm root is lowered into the pot. They had not stopped time beneath the ground or inside the smoke. They had only persuaded it to wait until spring.